thank you, Jordan, and thank you on behalf of not only myself, but also the whole team at Needles Eye. We really appreciate you guys being with us today. So I'm going to be pretty quick, but fairly thorough in my introduction because I've known Doug for a long time, but some of this you may not know. He began as a sworn officer in Henrico County in 1972, but prior to that, which I think is extremely impressive, he was in the United States Army and served in Vietnam, where he earned 2 Bronze Stars, the Air Medal with V device for heroism in aerial flight, and 14 awards for the Air Medal for combat missions. Quite impressive, Doug. He was promoted through the ranks in Henrico County and eventually became Chief of Police in 2011. Most recently, he was appointed to serve as Henrico County's Deputy County Manager for Public Safety on January 23 of 2016. Educationally, he has an associate's degree in criminal justice and holds a bachelor's degree in organizational management. Among other postgraduate studies, I will highlight 2. He has completed the Professional Executive Leadership School at the University of Richmond and the Senior Management Institute for Police at Harvard University. I've known Doug for over 25 years, and he has been a former speaker for us on multiple occasions. He is currently on our board of directors, which we very much appreciate. He is a member of Weston Assembly of God, and I could tell you a lot more, but what I really want to tell you is this. As a native of Henrico County, I can tell you firsthand, this man is an asset to this county and this community. Help me welcome my friend, our speaker, Colonel Doug Middleton.
My only regret is the county manager wasn't here to hear that. I'm very happy to see a lot of you here. So there's some folks here I haven't seen in a pretty good while, and some folks that I see with some regularity that I work with, and just a lot of friends. And some from my Bible study, some from the office, some from other departments in the county, some from church, and some who I just know from days gone by. We work together in a lot of things in the church. So it's just, I'm happy to see all of you here, and I want to thank you for being here to listen to me today. Buddy asked me to focus specifically on criticism because he figured that if anybody ever gets criticized, it's most likely a police chief, and he couldn't be more correct. In fact, I have a lot of sympathy and empathy for any CEO and any law enforcement agency, because no matter where you are, there is a population of people who always know how to do your job better than you do. And for me, it was 330,000 people. And so you get a lot of emails, and you get a lot of comments, and you get a lot of questions about things, but you know, I always refer back to the words of Winston Churchill, who said that criticism may not be agreeable, but it's necessary. It fulfills the same function as pain in the human body. It calls attention sometimes to an unhealthy state of things. And whether that unhealthy state is the individual at whom the criticism is directed or the person who is doing the criticizing, it always points something out. And I've learned to ask some questions myself about criticism because I have been exposed to it so much over the period of my career. I spent 44 years in the police division before I moved to the manager's office. And of those 44, I spent 22 of them, half of them, on the executive staff of the police division. So you're going to get criticized. And I used to ask myself, and I still do, where I get to see this, is what's being said about me true? If it is, then is it really truly something I need to react negatively to, or do I need to check my own self? It's important to consider what's being said about you, the context in which it's being communicated, and whether or not it is, in fact, a true statement. Is it based on ignorance? You know, I think social media has created a lot of ignorance when it comes to criticism. People will read something on a social media outlet and they immediately assume that it's fact. They don't do their own fact finding, and I think it's changed how people criticize because they don't have to confront a person or make themselves known to them. And oftentimes they're criticizing people they've never even met or talked to or asked about the issue. But critical comments that are based on total ignorance or a lack of understanding of the facts are things that I think you have to measure when you're being criticized. And this third thing that I try to look at is this just mean-spirited. Are those that are spreading the criticism attempting to alter the truth in a manner that will accomplish an end result that they are seeking, not one that is legitimate and in fact suits the purposes of the organization or the person or the facts of what have been going on. That type of criticism is hurtful. It's oftentimes filled with lies. It's fabricated. It can be misleading. And it's ultimately displeasing to God. Criticism hurts the person to whom it targets, and those who will to have their own ways at times will stop at nothing less than criticizing a person without legitimate justification. I want to share a few personal experiences with you, and as I go through some of these, there's at least one person in this room today who, in some of these experiences, was a big support to me, and I will not tell you who that person is, but she's wearing a police uniform. And I'm happy to see her here today. About 15 years ago, I was the deputy chief of police for the organization, and there were a group of people who were unhappy. And they were unhappy in some cases for a lot of legitimate reasons. And they began a campaign of writing letters. These letters were based on what I think was a morale problem, things that weren't being done that they thought should be done. And I had a specific responsibility to carry out and initiate actions in the division as basically the executive officer of the organization. And it made me an easy target, even though maybe in some cases I was having to do things that I would have done differently or disagreed with. It didn't matter. It was my responsibility, and I was either going to be loyal or I wasn't. So they began to write a lot of anonymous letters. They were filled with a lot of false accusations. In fact, in one case, I know one individual who, and during the course of all of it, befriended me because he realized that some of the things that were being written, and he knew them to be false and told them they were false, and they still wrote them, came to me to make me aware that he was done with it. The letters were being sent to county officials. They were being sent to state elected officials. Superintendent of state police got one. The governor got one. They were requesting that an investigation for malfeasance be initiated. They were really very hurtful, and in many instances they were demanding my termination from the county manager and the board of supervisors. I wasn't the only one being attacked by these letters, so was the police chief. Where I think it became the most hurtful is when they began to attack my faith and they began to attack my family. And I really struggled through that. I remember one night, one of the letters came to my home, and of course I don't know where it came from. My wife got it, and it upset her quite a bit, to read the things that were in there, because we've been residents of this county and for so many years, and this was coming from inside the very organization I had committed my life to serve. And we sat on the front porch and we cried together. And I tell you, that sort of was a little bit of a turning point for me. I know it was for her, because I felt like we'd sort of let some emotions out together. And we were going to get through this, and we were going to get through it together. And we never shared any of this with our children. We just decided we were going to struggle through it together, and we're going to trust God. We were not going to go on a defensive. We were not going to go on an offensive. We were just going to trust God, that people would know who we truly were and what we truly represented, that we were sincere. And while maybe we've made some mistakes along the way, openly and admittedly, they were not done with the intention that was being painted. So I think that particular point was an interesting point. But after about the fifth or the sixth letter, and I don't remember exactly how many there were, I happened to be in the hallway one day, and the Fraternal Order of Police president, who was a fellow believer, approached me. And he said, "I understand from some folks that you are trying to find out who's been writing all of these letters that have been attacking you." And he said, "and if you can, that you're going to sue them for defamation of character." And I kind of smiled and I looked at him and I said, you know, that's just not true. That's just another falsehood that's being told to put fear in the hearts of people. I'm not trying to find out who's doing it. In fact, I don't even want to know. Because some of those folks, I'm sure I pass them in the hallway. I'm sure that I probably even work with some of them. But you be sure and tell them this. I am not trying to find out who they are. I have no intentions of taking a single soul to court over anything. And I forgive them. Let's move on with the tasks in front of us. And for me, that was a big deal to get past that and to be able to say unilaterally, I don't know who you are. And today, I mean, I know who a couple of the folks are because they've approached me and offered apologies for that time in history. But a lot of them, I still don't know who they were, and I'm still okay with that. So that was 15 years or so ago. About 7 years ago, our police chief announced that he was going to retire. And needless to say, I was one of the candidates who was being considered for appointment. And I never really sought after it. I was asked to consider it, and I did. But there were some folks who were adamantly opposed to me ever being the chief, probably part of it based on the history that I just described to you. And there was a web page that was put up to oppose Doug Middleton being the police chief. And I really was okay with that too. If I got it, that was great. I would give it all I had. But if it wasn't in God's plan for me to be the chief because of things like that, well, I trusted God to do what needed to be done. And the individual who was the primary soul behind starting all of that had actually met with the county manager. He made no bones about who he was. But he met with the county manager, he met with board members, and he expressed his adamant opposition to me being appointed chief. And I just chose to let my record stand on its own and not worry about it. Well, after I had been the police chief, a close friend of mine who was also a close friend of this individual passed away, and I saw him at a funeral, and he asked if he could talk to me. We went into a back room there at the funeral home, and he just started crying. And he said, I've never been more wrong about a person in my life. And I think part of that was I just never came back at him. I never came back after him for anything. I just left it up to God to defend me and my reputation to stand on its own. That was 2 years after that particular incident took place. There was another instance where I really came under some scrutiny from the community when we had an armed robbery, and some of the folks in this room will remember this case, where a robbery had taken place in Newport News, James City County. The robbery suspects came into the county, and when they got here, we actually engaged them in a pursuit, which resulted in gunfire being exchanged in 3 different places in the eastern portion of our county as our officers attempted to apprehend these individuals who had displayed weapons and fired at other individuals. There were some near misses with our officers in those shootings that were occurring along this route. Ultimately, the van stopped in one location. The driver exited, ran up into what is a swampy area out in the eastern portion of the county near the airport. The other individuals in the van took off. A crash occurred. There was a shootout, and the driver of the vehicle was shot and killed by one of the officers. But fortunately, none of our officers were seriously injured in that, and there were some close calls. Well, the individual who had been driving and escaped and ran up into the wooded area was still on the loose. And I almost immediately started getting emails from people in the community who were extremely upset, were criticizing me, were calling me inept in what I was trying to do because we had not apprehended this person. Now, I knew because I was at the scene and I stayed there, and we had a good perimeter up, and we were going to catch this guy. And we were doing everything we could to apprehend him. We knew he didn't know the area, and we knew he was in a swamp. And at some point in time, he was going to have to come out. So we positioned people all over that portion of the county in an effort to try to catch him, but we were using a lot of unmarked cars and plainclothes officers because if he came out, we didn't want him to know that's who that was. We were trying our best to covertly catch him. And people weren't seeing our officers. So that was what I was getting complaints about. We've had this guy on the loose and there's nobody out here. Well, the truth is they were everywhere. 36 hours later, 2 of our officers, we thought that the railroad tracks that went through that area were a likely point of escape for the individual. And 2 of our officers were on stationary post at the railroad tracks, and here he comes walking the tracks. They approached him. He was in his underwear. He was muddy and nasty, and he had about 2 million mosquito bites. And he begged them to take him to jail. But the point that I'm making there is a lot of times people just don't know. They don't know, and they'll criticize you because they just don't know. I guess the best example I can give you of a person who withstood criticism biblically is Nehemiah. If you look at the book of Nehemiah, chapter 2, he was called to rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem, and he moved forward with trying to do that. He recruited the Israelites. He got all kinds of affirmations from the king that he served to do this, and he set out to rebuild those walls. But it wasn't without opposition or criticism. If you look at the 17th verse in that book, in that chapter, you'll read this. You see the trouble we're in. He's talking to the Israelites. Jerusalem lies in ruins. Its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me, and they replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked them and ridiculed them. What are you doing? They asked. Are you rebelling against the king? So here's Nehemiah with his mission challenged, being laughed at by these 3 individuals who have some prominence in the community. But he pressed on. And he demonstrated that when we're operating within the purpose and the will of God, when our heart's in the right place, and when we're challenged by the very people who are trying to benefit the most, we're often criticized by those who are either jealous or who have their own agenda. Nehemiah didn't allow these men to stop him. His purpose and his mission were clear to him. He was confident he was serving that which God had called him to do. The criticism of Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem didn't stop at this point. In fact, it intensified. In chapter 6 of Nehemiah, somebody could get me a glass of water too, I'd appreciate that. In chapter 6 of Nehemiah, we learn that 4 times they tried to get Nehemiah to come down to a valley and meet with him, each time requesting him to come down and alone to meet with them. They were scheming to do harm to him. He knew this, so each time he sent messengers down with a reply. And this was his reply. I love this reply. I'm carrying out a great project, and I cannot go down. Thank you. Why should the work stop while I leave and go down to you? He just stayed committed to what was in front of him. The 5th time Sanballat sent his aide to Nehemiah with the same message, but this time he's sending with a letter. The letter was unsealed. Now, in that time, when a letter was unsealed, it meant that anyone whose hands it passed through could read the letter. That was the intent. Let's spread some stuff that's not true about Nehemiah. That was their intent. And here's what the letter said. It's reported among the nations, and Geshem says it's true, that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt, and therefore you're building a wall. Moreover, according to these reports, you're about to become their king, and you've appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem. There's a king in Judah. Now, this report will get back to the king, so come on down here, let's meet, and let's talk this through. Being confident he was doing the right thing and that he was clearly within the realm of God's intended plan, Nehemiah decided to just keep working. And here was his response back to those 3 men. Nothing like what you're saying is happening. You're just making it up out of your head. Now, those are the very words from the New International Version. I love it. Nehemiah knew they were just trying to frighten him and the people, and they wanted to weaken the spirit of the folks that were working on that wall, and they wanted to put fear in their hearts. And Nehemiah, however, was a man who simply let his record stand with his people, and he didn't worry about it. He prayed to God, strengthen my hands. Strengthen my hands. I just think that's a wonderful example. Now, at one point, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem got a prophet that had worked in the community to go to Nehemiah and try to tell him that these three men were coming to kill him. Nehemiah rejected that, and when he rejected it, it was because he knew that they were trying to get him to go into the temple and hide, and if he hid, that it would send a message to the people. And his statement was this to that prophet: should a man like me run away, or should someone like me go into the temple to save his life? I will not go. And he continued his good work. You know, when we're criticized, we can find someone to talk to that we trust. We can pray to God on our own. We can understand our purpose and our testimony in the middle of criticism and work our way through it. But most importantly, we can forgive those who are doing it and stay content to be focused on the work God's put in front of us, not to become defensive and not to become offensive. When you've done your due diligence in life, and when you have lived the example of a godly life that you're called to, when you have found the strength that you need in your hands to serve God the way He wants you to serve Him, your response to criticism needs only be what it was for Nehemiah. Let your record speak for itself. Forgive those who criticize you and do so unilaterally. There was probably no one in the world who was more criticized than Jesus Christ Himself. Here is an individual who came to save the world and everyone in it. But He was crucified on a cross for all of us. He was beaten. He was spit on. He was cursed. He was whipped until his flesh was stripped from his back. He was beaten, nailed to a cross, speared in the side, and he died. That was the ultimate criticism, in my opinion. And you know what? As bad as things may have seemed for me in some of the cases that I have experienced, nothing has ever risen to that level. But during the time that he ministered, and he was undergoing this criticism for the full time he ministered, not one time did he go on the defensive, not one time did he go on the offensive, and even to the Sanhedrin Council, he did not defend himself. He let who he was stand on its own. He let God become his defender. In fact, as he died on the cross, what was the one thing that he said? Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. So if we want to avoid criticism as believers, we can basically do nothing, say nothing, and ultimately become nothing. But that's not what God wants of us. If we're going to be faithful servants, we're going to stay focused on accomplishing a mission that He wants, regardless of how intense the criticism we may confront in our work. And believe me, I believe our jobs, I especially believe the job of a police officer is a calling from God, and I believe that because order in our society is ordained of Him, by Him. It's important for us to stay focused on what that purpose is. And when we lose that focus, we lose the intensity of our jobs, our tasks. We become fearful, we get on the defensive, and we're no longer effective at what we do. And I think that's what God intends of all of us when we're truly serving Him through our work. A good job is a gift, and we have an obligation to exercise our faith through the way that we live every day in what we do. Will you join me in prayer? Father, I thank You for the opportunity today to share with my friends that are here today and folks that have come to just hear what someone else has experienced. I appreciate the opportunity to tell them the guidance and the help that You've given me and You have blessed me with in my life. But help us to remember, God, that the most important thing is not to be driven by people's praise, and it's not to be slowed by their criticism. It's to stay focused on Your will for our life and the mission that You have put in front of us. Avoiding criticism is easy when we do nothing and we say nothing and we ultimately end up being nothing. But the course of time has demonstrated that You are the provider and that You will strengthen us if we stay true to that will, to Your will, and to the mission which You have called us. Thank You for what You have done for each of us here today. And thank You for this opportunity to spend this time together. In Christ's name I pray, and I pray for everyone here. Amen. Thank you, buddy.
Thank you, Doug. We have time, and we had intended to have time for a few questions. So everything's on the table, right? They can ask anything they want to. Maybe?
Maybe.
So usually the hard time here is the first question. So somebody kick us off. Who has a question for Colonel Middleton? Yes, ma'am. Doug, come on up here.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the comments and sharing. My question is actually when the folks doing the criticizing or trying to cause the decisiveness or the, separating and thinking about, what if they are professing and presenting themselves as believers and that they feel equally as strong about what they are criticizing or saying is because they've been given, that it's coming from God? Like, how do you deal with almost both, two separate sides are both claiming and feeling so strongly about how they are moving forward in their actions as being, divine and the path?
Well, that certainly can happen, and I don't know that. I think you always have to kind of weigh things. One of the greatest examples of conflict where there were two opposing sides who professed that God was on their side was the war between the states. The Confederates and the Union both claimed God was on their side, and there were people who were believers who prayed every day that God would give them victory in the battles and that they would ultimately win that war. I think where criticism is concerned, the same thing will eventually occur. And I think some of the people who, in some of the experiences I had, especially 15 years ago, the ones that came to me were believers. Some of them were believers. And, the fact that over a period of time, it became apparent that what they had done, even if some of the things they said were true, the way they had done it, they felt guilty about. That's not how Christians resolve things with each other. They confront each other. And that's scriptural. When they don't do that, when they don't take the time to confront a brother or sister who they believe has done something that's not in keeping with what their faith should be calling them to do, which I think, again, is scriptural that we do that, then they themselves have committed something I think that's offensive to God. And I think that's where we have to be careful not to go on the defensive against them. It's okay to be truthful, but you have to be truthful with a kind heart and a compassionate spirit. And I think sometimes when that happens, people will talk. I mentioned about the letters and the conversation with the president of the FOP, and when I told him, just tell them that to go back and tell them, I forgive them. This is behind me. There were no more letters after that. That was the end of it. And I think he went back and communicated that. But I also think he realized enough's enough. There's a right way to do things in a wrong way. And I appreciated the fact he did that, and truth is, he became a really good friend of mine over time, and we still are good friends. But I don't know. I think it'll all vary. It depends on the circumstances, and it depends on what the motive is. Even if they're a believer, if it's the motive that makes the difference and how passionate they are about getting that motive across. And sometimes, listen, I'm sure you've never been criticized, buddy,
No.
by believers. But pastors go through this all the time. I can tell you, I've talked to my pastor multiple. He even comments from time to time from the pulpit when he'll say something. He said, "Okay, I know I'm going to get a lot of emails about that." So that happens. Even though they're people who they care about and they're there to serve. But I don't know that there's a specific thing or specific way to handle it. I think you just have to learn to pray for the person that you believe has been offensive and unilaterally forgive them, just as Christ forgave us.
Thanks, Doug. Another question? Joe?
Yeah, did you have to call for reinforcements in your prayer life? Or did you kind of sustain yourself on a level? Did you ramp up your prayer life doing that?
Oh, yeah. And I never hesitate to call for reinforcements. I've called this man multiple times. I've called my pastor. Let me tell you, the one person who I have the greatest faith in terms of their prayers is my daughter. She's a prayer warrior if I've ever met one. I think God actually talks to her. She's very knowledgeable biblically, and I mean, I just think that, and I see that even now in my son, when, we'll have a Sunday dinner together and the two of them are talking about things from the Bible at the table. I'm thinking, I really should be the one leading this. But you know what? I'm glad to see my children have engaged that thought process and that they're sharing with each other like that. But yes, I mean, and my wife. I mean, there are people in your life. I have people at work I go to for prayer. And I can tell you, when I sat at the chief's desk, I can't tell you how many people would come to my office from time to time and ask me about a problem or tell me about an issue. And they knew there was nothing I could do to resolve it, but they just wanted me to pray for them. And I have done that more times than I can count in my office in the police division when I was the chief.
One last quick question. Yes, sir.
Do you feel there's ever a good time to be defensive or offensive? A right time?
Well, yeah, again, it goes back to what the circumstances are. I will tell you, when comments were made about my wife and my faith and my children's faith, that was a real struggle for me not to go on, not just the defensive, but the offensive. But up to that point, I had survived that criticism, and I just made a decision I wasn't going to do it. And I talked to them about that. That was the first conversation as a family that we had about all of that ordeal. And they agreed that look, God's going to get us through this thing, regardless of what truth there may be, regardless of what fiction there may be, the way this is being done is wrong. So let's just trust God to get us through it. And that's what we did, and ultimately it worked.
Thanks, Doug. Appreciate it.